Welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder. Barnaby's is one of the leading search engines for art, design, antiques and collectibles from over 3,000 auction houses worldwide. We aim to make the art and auction market more transparent and accessible to everyone, from beginners to collectors and professionals. In today's episode of Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder, we talk to Betsy Thomas, an art specialist, appraiser, writer and educator with a long experience of the industry who worked for both Christie's and Sotheby's. Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Valuing art, design, antiques and collectibles is an art, I would say. Tell us a little bit more about the work as an expert and your experience with valuations. I mean, it might be hard to summarize in a few minutes, but how does it work actually? How does one value a painting?
Sure. Well, I'll take you back a little bit in my past history, which I think provides some necessary context. I began my career in the art world, as many do, in the auction house, in my case, Christie's in New York, where I became a fine art specialist, specializing more in the realm of European art, working in multiple departments, but ending up in the 19th century division. What I can say is that working in an auction house is probably the most perfect kind of training ground that you can have because of the sheer volume of artworks that come, through the door to be valued and identified. So quite an important part of my job when I first started my career was engaging directly with the artworks, cataloging the paintings and drawings and even some sculptures in the warehouse, going on client visits, learning how to handle the works. And then, of course, learning how to put estimates and valuations on them. So I really learned how to train my eye, and education never stops, as you know. So, I was able to hone my skills and recognize quality from, the more average picture to the exceptional one. So after 15 years, I started my own consultancy and basically took my skill set, which has really allowed me to build up my advisory and appraisal practice. So even though I, came out with a lot of experience in European in the 19th century, my purview has had to kind of expand, over the years to embrace a wider span of centuries, even up to post-war. And as you know, I'm sure in light of the development of art as a quote, unquote, hard asset class, collectors, bankers, underwriters, and lawyers are really more and more reliant on competent valuations. So I do different types of valuations depending on what the client needs. But I would say that the reports that are most in demand are those needed for insurance purposes, charitable contribution, fair market value, estate purposes. And I see a lot of the art that I appraise in person at a client's home or warehouse. But of course, many works, have to be judged on the basis of photographs as well.
But it's not that I, discredit your ability to do valuations, but do you also use second opinion? Because obviously it can be tricky.
There are many criteria when valuing a piece of art. And what do you look at first? I think it really begins, and it should begin with a physical examination of the work of art, if possible in the flesh. But if not, as many photographs as you can get. The artwork can really reveal so much. So, I like to say it's the specialist's job to help the work reclaim its identity, and giving it a valuation, of course, is a key part of that identity. So you have to kind of look at valuation like detective work. But yes, you do draw in some consultants if you need help. But the first thing is really to look at its identifying features through really an empirical lens. So an analysis of the medium, whether it's canvas or panel. This might hint at a work's age, of course. Condition, of course, is a key factor that tells us if the work has been restored, and if so, how much. It has been restored if it's been a good restoration campaign. And then, of course, in the fine art world, finding initials or signatures will really allow you to identify the artist. So then you measure and, you identify the subject matter. But I think that specialists do have to rely on outside help. And I'll get to your question insofar as we're assigned to do evaluation and we're only able to communicate to the best of our ability, our opinion and value, based on the evidence, and then what we have at our fingertips. And research, if possible, within the boundaries of sometimes what we're given is a fairly short time frame. But, research is an important tool. If you check that the work is in a catalog raisonné, you're, doing your due diligence. That's the official listing of an artist's repertory. But if it's not in the catalog raisonné, then you often have to reach out to the scholar or the committee who is compiling that work, that artist's repertory. And this is where you find help, if you can, within the network of, your colleagues. But again, authenticity is one of the big, key factors in, valuation, of course.
But what would you say is most important then? Is it when you start to look at the painting, is it the quality of the work? Is it the signature, or is it the provenance? Or because obviously you start somewhere, right? You start with a feeling, don't you?
Yes. Well, again, you really have to try to identify as many features of the work as you can. You're often not going to find exactly the answer you want. And I would probably shift to talk about old masters in this context, because the main challenge with many old master paintings, which of course covers 500 years of, history, is that the vast majority are not signed. So identification really is the key objective. And with this 500 plus year gamut of artistic and studio practice, this is easier said than done. So much of the shaping of value is linked to how close one can get to full authorship. So for instance, a genuine work by the Baroque painter Guido Reni will no doubt be, more desirable and valuable than a second-rate copy. Taking into account another painter, a good example is Canaletto, whose scenes of Venice were in high demand in the 18th century. But there arose an entire cottage industry around Canaletto as many artists took up the brush, and set about to paint similar Venetian views because they were so highly in demand. But these views are done in varying degrees of success, and some are, I would say total rubbish. But there's a market even out there for some of the more inferior works. But how do you differentiate on the value spectrum? And what if your assignment timeline does not really allow for a lot of expert consultations? So what I have, what I can say is that as what auction houses do, they've adopted a kind of a tiered classification system that seeks to set a kind of standard of identification. And these parameters and criteria can remain a little, I guess, fuzzy and imperfect at the edges. But what you have to impose on this kind of broad spectrum of works is a framework that can be used as a guide if you are doing valuations. And it depends on the kind of levels of how to sort all the levels of quality. So imagine a top-down sort of pyramid, and this configuration places, the higher quality works with full authorship at the very tip top, at the apex. Then as you descend and the pyramid gets wider at each band, there are labels or qualifiers that basically suggest a certain degree of distance from the direct hand of the artist. And so on the value spectrum, you can follow this structure to go from most expensive to least expensive. So for instance, as an example, if I were to place an attributed to Canaletto label, it is probably a work by the artist, but I don't have that key information to necessarily lock it down for full authorship. Whereas lower down on that pyramid, if I put after examination of a work, manner of, then I'm indicating that I'm pretty sure the work is not only late, from a later century, maybe even the 20th century, it's emulating the style of the artist, but it's inferior and therefore much farther away from full authorship, sort of in the pattern of concentric circles. So that's helpful in providing a framework for old masters. It's a little easier, of course, in 19th century and Impressionist art because you have signed works generally. But then there can be the question of, again, is it an authentic work?
But what about if we stay with the old master for a while? What is the difference then in the valuation if it's, if it's signed, but also if it's a confirmed original piece by Canaletto, for example, and if it's manner of? What's the difference in value?
Oh, quite a wide difference. I would say you've got a lot of different zeros. If you have a huge scene that shows the Grand Canal with all of the buildings and the regatta, you could be in the $8 to $10 million range. But if you are in a kind of pasticheur, someone who's painting or even trying to copy building by building that particular scene, it would be more like, sort of $2,000. Or maybe $800. It also depends on the size and depends on how decorative it is. But again, a lot of these pieces are enjoyed for their decorative value, but it's our job to make sure that, we are positioning them in their proper context within the scope of the art market.
And this is why it's so important also to buy art where you actually can trust the source and the valuation.
Yes, exactly.
But when you visit a fair, the artworks are often restored and look like they were painted yesterday. But what is it that the market really wants, or at least is willing to pay the most for? Is it artworks that are untouched or restored?
Well, I think it depends on what market you're talking about, and it depends on the marketplace. Now, at a fair, you will generally see works put into their best clothes, in a sense. They are cleaned, they're reframed, they are well lit at the booth, and they are there to attract attention. But let's talk about the auction world for a moment. This is a world that, again, is very fast-paced. There's a high volume of sales. Some sale rooms have sales every month. Again, Christie's and Sotheby's and Phillips and Bonhams have multiple sales a month. So there are estates that roll in. There are single consignments that come in the door. There are discoveries that come in the door. But again, I would say in the old master world, it's highly plausible that you're going to see a work that's in what we call estate condition. It's going to present a surface that's quite dirty, or again, there may have been a previous restoration campaign, what looks like a red dress, what was a red dress may look brown because, again, it's so dirty. There may be tears or punctures, but on the whole, barring a few exceptions, and mainly these are in the very high levels, the market actually prefers to have the old masters sold as is and left untouched. Because then, particularly if they're bought by the dealers or the trade, they will be then researched, they will be restored by particular people that might have an expertise in restoring panels versus canvas. So, in a sense, only an auction house that feels that the work will sell much better if it's cleaned will contact their consignor to say, this is the best idea and we think it's worth the investment. I know that in the world of 19th century paintings, kind of the opposite holds true. In my career, we were very keen to clean and restore the more important paintings, let's say over a value threshold of sort of $100,000 plus, so that we could really make the composition shine. There were often a lot of details because these were multi-figural compositions with lots of details and activity. And really, it did correlate often to a painting achieving a higher price.
I mean, you have students, you teach.
I do.
What are you actually teaching your students? Is it what to look for, or is there any magic you're teaching out?
Well, valuation is really, I think, the fundamental backbone of, the art market. And therefore, in order to succeed in any job, I believe, or any kind of work that is inside this wonderful world we call the art world, you need to have a basis in valuation. So what I teach my students is that there is a methodology behind valuation, and it can be applied to really any type of art. But you need to understand the factors that basically drive valuation. So we call these value drivers, and these are the kind of criteria that, again, or checklists that a specialist would use when you are, again, examining a work of art. And I put them into two buckets, which is the empirical and the non-empirical. The empirical, again, has to do with put the artwork at the center of your universe first, because it is going to speak to you if you give it enough time. That is, please look at the front, look at the back, see how it's made. Is it laid down on panel? Has the integrity of the work been compromised? How has it been signed? And then again, looking at in a historical context, where does this particular work fit within the repertory of the artist? Is it an early work, middle period work, or late work? And then what we do is basically look at the kind of mechanics of valuation, which is, I kind of parallel it to, another tangible asset class, which is real estate. And as you know, valuation of any kind of tangible work of art, and even real estate, should be based on fundamentals. And fundamentals is data that can be found in the marketplace. So for us, the valuers, the market data that is available are the past auction sales, so past market performance. And just as in the real estate world, the appraised value of a home is based on a series of, similar homes in the same neighborhood, generally the same size, square footage, and taking into account how many rooms and how much property is it on, and all these kinds of things. So art follows a similar roadmap using comparative analysis. So when we work and do our practice sessions in class, we are basically gathering what I call a data set together that usually consists of 3 comparables. And these works have been sold in public auction. They're by the same artist as the subject work that they're given to work on. And these are works that share several similarities to the subject work, but of course they're going to differ in some ways. So the task at hand is really to judge and compare the subject work on a spectrum of quality against those in the data set, and weigh the prices that were realized and position the value in relation to these works. So if, for instance, my value is deemed higher than those in the data set, it might be because the work is bigger or it's from a better date in the artist's career. And another rule to follow, which I'm always emphasizing, is to keep the comparables similar in a like-for-like manner. So if I'm going to value a landscape by Renoir, or I give the students a set to practice on, then we're not going to compare it to portraits by the artist or nudes by the artist, but other landscapes. So we do a lot of practice sessions, and that's really where you begin to gain a fluency, as well as reading the market through databases such as, Art Price and ArtNet and all of these and these things. But it is a skill, and it takes time to learn.
I was thinking about that because you said yourself you've been in the industry for many years. You saw and touched and felt a lot of different paintings and artworks. Can you learn without doing that?
In a sense, learning by doing?
Yeah.
I think you can. I think that if you are thrown into a warehouse, hopefully you have some sort of a mentor that you can, engage with. But basically the key to learning is really just looking at a lot of different items, looking at good works and why they're exceptional, and versus bad works. Because again, your eye begins to make these natural judgments of what is a good work by the artist, what is not, how to tell the difference between a sketch and something that is just, a copy or a fake or something like that. So I think it helps to have kind of an interest in art history, because again, I like to read about the artists and it does tell you a lot, but from really a point of view of just engaging with the works of art, picking them up, learning how to handle them, especially if you're in the object world, that's really important. Learning the difference between marble and alabaster. You can see that sometimes in a photograph, but quite frankly, alabaster will have a different feel altogether if you touch it. It feels not as smooth. It's like soap.
Exactly.
Yes, it's got a texture. And sometimes it's a little bit more dark because of the material natural coloration, whereas marble, of course, is cold, and the good marbles are very, very white. You don't want to have a lot of veining in the marble. But again, how do you know what you're looking at unless, you've seen other examples before?
True. Another thing is that the art and auction industry, I would say, have benefited of non-transparent market before. Today, the market is much, much more transparent. Would you say that is benefiting for valuations, but also in general? Or do you think that has become a problem?
It's a complex question, but I think that all in all, definitely more transparency is helpful in the market, as it has had a reputation for being opaque, not clear. And, I think that the more that the auction houses, again, they're very good at, in a sense, making sure that the experts are consulted for certain works of art. If there is no published data in a catalogue raisonné, or if the catalogue raisonné has not been written. Because basically what fakes and forgeries do to the market is they erode trust. And it's clear that every auction house in the world has had a problem here and there with some dubious pieces slipping in. But the more that you try to set up guardrails and safeguards, the more that your clientele will trust the system and bid. But when trust is eroded, it basically kills and suppresses value, and it can really be quite damaging. So I'm definitely for as much transparency as possible. And I'll tell you a quick anecdote about, the importance of being your own advocate when you're out there buying, because there are some traps and there are some things to avoid when you're buying. And I would say that if you are, and we are living in the internet age, you are charmed by a work of art that you see on an internet storefront, of which there are many, and the images are beautiful, you're not finished there. You don't just click and buy. No matter how sleek the site seems, in some cases when you're buying on kind of the retail level, and I'm not talking auction, but you can also do this, you have to ask questions. You have to be your own advocate, because caveat emptor, which means buyer beware, it is, a catchphrase for a reason. And I remember, because I do buy and sell, for my clients, having a situation a few years ago where I saw a lovely work of art. This was a contemporary work, but by an artist that was deceased. So it's a secondary market work. Let's just say he was in the sort of 1950s hard edge abstraction area with a lot of color, but non-representational. So I saw this work on one of the sites. I inquired with the dealer. I wanted the price. I wanted to find more pictures. I made him take pictures and a full condition report. And finally, an exhibition information provenance, which was kind of thin and there wasn't much. And I finally asked him, well, I know that this artist does not have a published catalog raisonné, but that there is a committee working on it. So do you have the confirmation that it's going to be included in the catalog raisonné? And he wasn't able to give that to me. And he hedged, and this went on for a couple of weeks where I kept asking and asking. And at one point he said, oh, well, I have to get it. I have to get it. But it was clear that he didn't have it and that he was basically trying to misrepresent the work as an autograph work when it really wasn't. And because it was, a non-representational, again, hard-edge abstraction, it could be very easy for someone to kind of, fake or do a cunning imitation. But, imagine if someone had come along and bought that work. And when I began to think more, I finally let it go because I didn't engage in it further. The price of that work, Pontus, was a little bit lower than it should have been. It was lower than the market value in the context of other works for that artist. And that's why having these skills, being able to know how to read the data points, which I could do very quickly, I came up with the conclusion that he was trying to move it quite quickly because it really wasn't a work by the artist. So that's unfortunately where there is no transparency. And you have to, do quite a lot of work. But I would say never let your guard down.
And when it's too good to be true?
It probably is. Exactly.
Does valuing sometimes also require the use of equipment to examine the work, like technical equipment, etc.?
Yes. And in fact, I carry a little bag with some tools. I carry with me a small handheld torch or flashlight, which is a very powerful white light. This is in order to see the surface details and inspect the work. You often go into homes where, these paintings are not professionally lit because they're not in a gallery context. So they may be in a corridor, they may be in a very dark spot. So despite trying to turn on as many lights as you can, your best tool is going to be a very powerful white light. If you can take the work off the wall and it's small enough to do so, I always ask to be able to do that. But if I can't, then you have to make, certain assumptions that it is, in solid shape. It's not going to, fall off its hinges. But the other tool that I use and a lot of experts use is the ultraviolet or black light, which really allows you to get under the sort of skin of a painting, because any recent restorations that would not be easily detected by the naked eye will fluoresce when you put black light on the areas of the painting. So that is how you can tell if some of the cheeks in a portrait have been reinforced with a little more pink, or if there had been a tear. Sometimes you actually see what looks like the letter T, and that is where a tear has been restored and usually addressed by a patch on the back. A measuring tape obviously is essential because it allows you to make, accurate measurements of a work. Even if the client has sent me a page by page description with measurements, I always do it again. And then another piece that wouldn't seem obvious, but is something that I've used a lot, is a jeweler's 10x loupe, the kind that you would look at, hard stones and diamonds with. This has been very useful, particularly when I, was looking at one work that was framed. It was a work on paper, under glass, kind of a dirty glass. It was thought to be an original watercolor, but in fact, once I put the loupe on it, you could see the dot matrix pattern that, of course, indicates it's a 20th century reproduction. So the loupe really saved the day on that because there was no way that I could get that work out of its frame.
Tell us about the most important or extraordinary valuation you encountered in your career so far.
This is, I suppose I'll choose an example of a piece that takes me back to my original training ground of the 19th century. And it's a work on paper that I examined. Again, it was matted and framed and under glass. And it was just an absolutely beautiful watercolor, a genre piece, which was an interior scene of a room in an upstairs of a house with a beautiful desk and a still life of flowers and a chair. And at the center was this lovely woman who was standing at the center of the composition, but she had a very pained expression on her face, almost like she was about to cry. And she was clutching a necklace, a beaded necklace, and the beads of the necklace were, you could tell that she'd broken the necklace because the beads had, fallen down and they were littering the floor. And there was so much wonderful detail in this work. It almost looked like a painting. She had used the artist had used a very, very small brush. And yet, looking and looking and looking, I could not find a signature. But I knew that it was something very special. And however, I couldn't, identify it. So again, having the ability to open up the frame, open up the mat, take the work out gave me the ability to look much closer. And once again, that 10x loop saved the day, because looking at the very, very corners of this, I guess it was about 20 inches high watercolor, I saw a signature that read in very tiny, tiny print, but the tiniest print I've ever seen, Anna Alma-Tadema. Now, if any of you know the 19th century Victorian world, Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema is one of the most celebrated Victorian painters of his day, and his work makes quite a lot of money on auction. So this was his daughter. So Anna Alma-Tadema was not really revered as an artist. She, as a woman, didn't have the same kind of ability to have a career as a man would, but she was very, very accomplished. She didn't exhibit that much here and there in London. Her market is tiny, really only in the UK. However, there was a market for it, and it sold quite well when it went to auction. And I feel that this is another example of a woman artist that needs to be championed further, because as you know, in this world, that women artists are being given a bit of a louder voice, which they've needed. But think about the secondary market artists, the artists that are deceased, that didn't have, weren't as well known. So I felt very satisfied in having helped, the client reclaim this kind of name and make it more visible. And even though it wasn't a huge amount, it was enough. And for me, that felt like, again, a memorable moment.
This is really the treasure hunt, isn't it?
It is.
And kind of the reward after all your work. But my last question will be, you mentioned it already, catalog raisonné, etc. But how important is the books for your work? They
are very important, but I would preface this by saying they're not always easily accessible. If I had, for every valuation that I do, if I had lots and lots of time, I would, absolutely love to dig into every single book that I can. But there are resources that are now much more available on the internet. And I think due to the pandemic, many more books have been digitized. There's something called the Internet Archive, which is kind of a free library where I found very old catalogs from, the 19th century, auction catalogs digitized. Anything you can do to add to the history, and I don't think we really touched on provenance, but provenance, which is the ownership history of a painting or work of art, is really key for valuation. It's something that legitimizes the work, because it basically, again, helps you trace the ownership history, and it traces a geographic footprint of the work as well. So from country to country. And so when a collector, name is revealed in the provenance and it's recognized and admired, whether it hails from a collection of a 16th century, Pope in Rome, or a 19th century robber baron, like J.P. Morgan, the work acquires really an elevated importance due to its association with a collection that was built with kind of a specific agenda and really set to a very high quality standard. So if I can find additional provenance for a work, then I am giving that much more of a history. And the valuation of these, where it's not really a formula based on a percentage, it's really a feeling, is what you were saying. It does definitely add to the desirability, and that's how you would talk about it in your justification. And so beyond catalog raisonnés, which again should list the most up-to-date exhibitions and provenance, there are things that you can do to try to find more, because some catalog raisonnés were published in the 1990s or even the 1980s. So there are ways that you can hunt for more. It's just having the time, which is difficult. But I know that some catalog raisonnés are now being published online, and there will not be a book form. And this will make it so much more accessible for researchers in all fields, whether you're, an art history, scholar or academic, or whether you're in the trade or working like we do in valuation.
Increased transparency, once again, is rewarding.
Definitely.
Betsy, thank you so much for participating in the podcast. Your presence now gave the podcast a better provenance, I would say.
Thank you very much for having me.
To keep up with the latest trends and receive weekly updates on the art and auction world, subscribe to our newsletter on barnabys.com or read Barnabys magazine online.